Hello, my name is Danny Music Lee. This presentation will explore the practice of genrefying school library collections, where materials in the collection are organized by subject and genre instead of by academic discipline and author. As school libraries adapt to the changing state of education, there are a few consistent goals. First, librarians are working to empower students to find the information that they need independently, and that is really key. A major goal of the Common Core standards is for students to be independent critical thinkers. They need to know how to sift through all the information that's out there to find what they need. Librarians are also working to connect students with books of interest quickly, right? We are saving the reader's time. Teachers are pressed for time and need library visits to be efficient. This doesn't really allow for one-on-one reader advisory services for a lot of students, so librarians need to employ other methods to put the best books in student hands. Librarians are also focused on curating student-centered collections. A lot of studies have found that browsing is necessary for book selection, so we want to make sure our collections are accessible and logical for the specific students who will be using it. And we are working to balance the focus on overall academic achievement with the interest and pleasure reading. Colleges put a lot of pressure on high school educators in particular to focus on reading achievement, and education psychologists have found that better readers are those who read more often. School libraries strive to create collections that engage their students and motivate them to read more often and more widely. So overall, we want to encourage those reluctant and striving readers to read more and use school library resources more effectively. So how do school libraries meet those goals? Traditional literacy development comes in the form of things like book talks and creating displays and hosting fairs and incentive programs and even teaching comprehension strategies or literacy skills. New strategies are being experimented with, like reorganizing the collection to increase access, or redesigning the library as a learning commons. The point is we want to give as many entry points into the collection as possible for as many students as possible. Access to that collection should be student-centric in the language, in the structure, and this presentation is going to explore the difference between traditional classification and genrefied classification in regards to how students actually use the collection. Should school libraries use genrefied classification systems for their collections? According to Butcher, most school libraries do actually use the Dewey Decimal System to arrange their nonfiction materials, and then fiction is of course arranged by author. It's used because it's universal across libraries, it's systematic, it organizes or attempts to organize all of human knowledge, which is pretty impressive. It has finely specific topics for nonfiction with the intent to make everything easy to find, and that gives us exact addresses, so we know exactly where on the shelf to look to find what we're looking for. In the fiction section, it keeps authors together neatly, and it gives equal treatment for all genres, although we will see this is not necessarily the case for the nonfiction. So why are libraries moving away from Dewey Decimal? It is outdated. It was created in the 1870s, and it was designed for the industrial era with different needs than the modern era. It was designed for trained professionals to use, not really for public use. Patrons didn't browse the stacks. The system assumes that readers came to the library knowing what they were looking for. It didn't really allow for browsing. And it can't keep up with the development of knowledge and interests in the last 250 years. It has a flawed thinking in the schema. It is very Eurocentric and very Victorian in its organization of knowledge. And it has a lack of attention to other cultures and belief systems that creates an inherent hierarchy which prioritizes Christian white male knowledge. This is problematic. It allows for pseudosciences like phrenology to have their own divisions. It allows for philosophy from non-white regions of the world to get 2 divisions out of 20. It allows for Christianity and European languages to make up 80 to 90% of the subclasses under religion and language. And that lack of attention to other areas of knowledge is a problem. It's also not all that intuitive. It's something that needs to be taught to understand how to use it efficiently. Similar subjects can end up scattered across the library because they're not part of the same academic discipline, despite having other relationships. Douglas Betts commented on this in his 1982 study. He mentioned that creating a logical set of relationships between subjects fails to take into account the interests that lead people to approach those subjects. So common interests end up inconveniently separated, and unrelated interests end up inexplicably together because they are part of the same academic discipline, and that doesn't necessarily benefit the average library user. He says books should be grouped to reflect the actual or potential interest relationship between them, even if that means fragmenting the traditional classification sequence. So student use of the Dewey Decimal System has So how does all of this affect how students actually use the library? Librarians have argued that too much time is being spent teaching search and navigation strategies instead of actually using the materials. For children, the Dewey system is not that usable. Children are focused on subjects, not on authors. Multiple studies have shown that author search is a poor way to guide students to fiction, especially. Dewey allows for simpler reader advisory services by topic for nonfiction, but a fiction librarian has to direct students to specific authors when what the student wants is a subject or maybe a genre. And students often don't know author names. They struggle with author searches in certain studies. Even if they do know the author, students have been shown to just struggle with navigating alphabetical collections at all. And decimals aren't even taught until 4th grade, but we expect young students to understand how the library is organized, despite the fact that they haven't learned the number sense in order to do that. Students struggle with book selection in general, so how do we support them? Genrefication is one response to the distance between Dewey and students. It is individualized to the library's community needs, not standardized across libraries. That way, it is responsive to student, staff, and curricular interests and needs. It encourages browsing by combining like materials, which expands browsing options by increasing findability. It makes the nonfiction collection vital and useful by using relevant subject groups for students rather than academic disciplines. And it exposes users to more works and authors and allows readers to browse by the reading experience that they're looking for. Its accessible organization is more manageable since a set of books that is organized by genre is inherently smaller than the entire fiction collection all at once. And while Reader Advisory Service is the most effective tool for finding what you're looking for, users want independent access to the collection, and that's important. The challenge is choosing the genre and subject categories that will actually be useful for the library. Librarians should curate sections into coherent and intuitive topics based on popular needs and interests. This happens through collection analysis and weeding to identify areas of need and respond to the interests of their community. Every library would be a little bit different. This specific breakdown that you see is maybe not necessary in a school with older students like a high school, but for an elementary school, it might be really useful. Overall, the goal is to have an authentic organization that aids in discovery for the school's population. And that happens through community analysis. So user studies and gathering stakeholder input are important. That can happen through having students do book sorting or subject organizing, assessing student attitudes, working with the book club and student library aides, and getting teacher support. How can the curriculum be supported by the library? So this example is the International School of Prague's elementary library. It's a genrefied fiction collection. The labels on the end caps have whole word labeling, student-friendly categories, and visually compelling signage. That's really important for the success of a genrefied collection. Natural language needs to be used instead of codes like what Dewey uses to make sure that it is easily navigatable for students. And the language can be used to evoke interest and wonder to increase engagement with the materials. The physical location of the books is also really important. The books should be actually grouped together on the shelves if possible, not just stickered on the spines. That does create more challenges. When you have a book that crosses genres, how do you decide where to put it? Do you file fiction with the nonfiction if they have similar topics? Do you separate out all of the books by one author if they have different genres? All of those can be flexible. You can move books that aren't circulating well. Or if you file the book with one genre initially and decide it's better with another later, you can encourage students to contest the locations of books. And the navigation of the collection can be supported by the digital catalog. The records can be updated in the catalog so specific titles are found more easily, especially since genrefication has less systematic findability for direct search. And the call numbers can be edited to include genre designations. As with any classification system, there are limitations to genrefying a collection. The ubiquity of the Dewey Decimal System might pose an issue. Do students need to know Dewey to navigate other libraries? And is that the responsibility of the school librarian to teach? Disparity in the organizational structure between different types of libraries can end up being problematic. The lack of standardization of a reader interest collection was linked to failure of those systems in the 70s and the 80s. Reader browsing habits in those types of collections may not get them what they're looking for, especially if they're missing cross-genre titles that are filed in a genre they didn't expect. Some argue that too much time is spent trying to find specific titles in a genrefied collection, and books by one author could become scattered because they span different genres. One author argued that school populations shift constantly, and so specializing a classification for one group of students may not be relevant a few years later, and you'd need to constantly update that system to reflect the true needs of the community. And then updating the catalog and undergoing this whole project of genrefying the collection is incredibly time-consuming, and it does still require some level of instruction on the organization of the collection, although perhaps it is a little bit more intuitive than the Dewey system, if it's done well. There are some more serious limitations to it. One is the problem of defining genre. Reader advisory requires deeper understanding of the appeals of a genre to make connections between readers and books. They may not seek a genre so much as the experience that they associate with it. This recalls a discussion between authors Neil Gaiman and Kazuo Ishiguro on the construct of genre as a boundary that stories just don't really need. And choosing genre can be ambiguous for books that have multiple genres involved. So how do you deal with that? Multiple copies for each relevant section is probably unrealistic for most libraries. So some researchers argue that we are better served providing involved direct reader advisory and creating useful collection guides than agonizing over genre choices. Reader advisory makes connections between titles across genres, and those are often connections that readers didn't think of on their own. Another issue is the potential for artificial hierarchies. Genres can, of course, be stigmatized. They can be used to reject materials in addition to selecting them. A genre choice for a book can send the message that one genre is higher in the hierarchy than others are, and readers can become limited by genre and not branch out to other books with similar qualities. Lechtenberg noted that we have to be careful not to steer patrons toward or away from material based on particular topics. So does genrefying a collection pose a danger there? And then there's the question of having cultural sections. Is that amplifying voices or alienating them? Genre labels based on race, sexuality, and gender risk reducing characters and stories to single-faceted human experience, which Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie warns against in her talk on the dangers of a single story. This can preclude some students from even checking out the book in the first place because they are separated out from other types of realistic fiction. One way to address some of these limitations is to combine principles of both Dewey and genrefication. Librarians can retain aspects of Dewey, but use student-oriented language to be more responsive to the specific community needs. That comes from Taylor. Witteveen and Marcoya argue that a Dewey light system, so to speak, retains the Dewey model, but removes underlying biases and outdated idiosyncrasies by putting an individualized layer of classification over Dewey. What that looks like is books are shelved by overall likeness to each other first, and then they are arranged by their Dewey classification, or alphabetized, within each group to keep titles easy to find directly. There's also the Book Industry Standards and Communications subject heading list used by bookstores. It's a whole language, reader interest approach to standardized classification, and libraries have adopted it. It's focused on relevance, so subject of interest is prioritized over academic discipline. It retains findability because it is standardized, and it encourages impulse borrowing and browsing, but it does have issues. Because it's designed for sales and not for libraries, it doesn't always have great variety of subject headings, especially for academic books, ironically, in the cultural studies areas and for multidisciplinary works. And it does still have the Dewey issue of multiple locations for some topics. And anyway, in practice, genrefied collections have found success in school libraries, at least in part due to the information-seeking habits in those collections. A lot of readers rely on family and friend recommendations to find books. A Pew study in 2012 found that 66% of readers relied on recommendations. Students in one study focused a lot on a section in the catalog called Most Checked Out. They used it as a recommendation tool. Another study found that students were more likely to leave with a book if they were browsing alongside peers. This social activity in the library is based on visible shared interests. You can actually see the genres and students can discuss preferences with each other. This is enabled by a genrefied collection, according to Moeller and Becknell. Search and selection also follow student logic in this type of collection. In one study, students grouped subjects in very different ways than the Dewey system because the Dewey system was not intuitive for them. Another study showed that students were reading across genres and they were comfortable with the concept of genre as a selection strategy anyway. So it doesn't seem too far of a stretch to ask them to search a library by genre. Students already asked for books that way anyway. They didn't ask by author in many cases, so why not organize the library by subject if that's what students are looking for in the organization? This free browsing and independence was really important to students as well. They wanted to be able to find books on their own without having to ask the librarian for assistance. And keyword identification and search is brought into the physical world in a genrefied collection. In digital media, students are used to genrefied collections. Spotify organizes music by genre. Netflix organizes film and television by genre. So why not start organizing physical materials that way as well? And Taylor's study found that readers are seeking experiences rather than objects when they are looking for a good book. They could be choosing books based on mood or peer recommendation or the experience sought. For example, in one study, graphic novels were the highest instance of browsing, and that is probably in part due to the experience of actually consuming a graphic novel. Realistic fiction was high up there on the list, as well as horror fiction and humor fiction as well. Many studies showed that a genrefied collection did work really well for students. Muller and Becknell found a lot of benefits, including the decreased time to actually locate books of interest. Students felt empowered, like their voices were heard. They were providing reader advisory for each other, and they showed that they really understood the collection. They became experienced users of it because it was much more visible and logical to them. Before, they didn't really have a way to explore fiction in the collection because subjects were kind of random since it was alphabetized by the author instead of by any sort of subject. Genrefying it allows for much more focused browsing, which in turn helps save students time and empowers students to find materials on their own if they want to. It also frees up librarians. They can be more focused on helping students become readers rather than teaching them how libraries and catalogs are organized. And it engages students more. It's more focused on student interest. Students use the catalog to find other books in a genre, or other books written by authors that were noted in book talks, or that write in similar genres, according to Morion's study. This awareness of and interaction with other genres kind of quells the fear that readers get stuck in a genre niche. In many action research studies, genrefication had significant benefits over more traditional classification systems, despite its limitations. It proved more effective use of the library. More variety of checkouts happened, and a greater volume of checkouts happened per student. There was also an increased observation of browsing in most of the studies. Because the collection was easier to navigate independently, students were more likely to actually use it. The co-location of related subjects also saved student, teacher, and librarian time. And in surveys, students expressed a preference for genrefied collections over alphabetized. There were also academic benefits. Students were making connections between genres as well as between fiction and nonfiction. The curricular materials are easier to compile for teachers, and they are more findable for students working on projects with specific information needs. And even just the concept of genre became more concrete for many students since it is actually visible in the library. And of course, the flexibility of a genrefied collection is actually an advantage. Local consideration in the creation of that collection drives its customization. The ambiguous nature of genre is actually a benefit. It makes it easier to fit the individual community needs. And genrefying the collection acknowledges that readers have different tastes, and having a preference for one genre over another doesn't make you a snob. It's much more important in school libraries to foster engagement with reading rather than push students into new genres or levels, so to speak. And anyway, students were found to read more variety of genres after genrefying the collection. Responsive collections confirm to students that their interests, needs, and experiences are valued, and that is key when your goal is engagement. The collections were more accessible. People who won't ask for help should also be able to find what they need. The point is, we should provide the points of entry that people are looking for to make the collection as accessible as possible, not the points of entry that we think they need.